Hello everyone! In this lesson, we will learn how to generate HTML based on JSON data on the fly. However, before we get into that, I first want to take just a minute or two to congratulate you because since you've completed the previous lesson, you can now say that you've worked with the WordPress REST API. So the question becomes, what in the world does that mean? What is the WordPress REST API? It's a term that we did not hear in the previous lesson because there were already enough buzzwords and phrases floating around and I didn't want to bombard you with yet another one. But now that we're in a new lesson, I want you to know what the WordPress REST API is. The simplest answer is that these different URLs that we've been learning about that return JSON, right? These URLs where at the end of the root of the WordPress URL you add on /wp-json, wp-v2, and then posts or pages or something else. These URLs make up what is known as the WordPress REST API. And the entire point of the REST API is that it makes it possible to work with WordPress data and content outside of the context of the PHP programming language. Because basically every modern programming language today can send HTTP requests to URLs like this, and also every modern programming language can interpret JSON data. Now in our case, in this course, we are using JavaScript, but you could technically create a native Android or iOS application that communicates with a WordPress website through the REST API. Or you could create a Ruby or Python or Node.js app that communicates with WordPress. So the REST API really opens up what's possible with WordPress because it makes the 4 CRUD operations available from just about anywhere. But what does that mean? What is CRUD? CRUD is an acronym that stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. Now, at this point in the course, we've only learned about the R in CRUD when it comes to the REST API. R stands for read, which is just another way of saying load. So, for example, in our previous lesson, we learned how to use jQuery to send off a request to this URL, and our goal was to read or load JSON data, right? We wanted to read in information about existing posts. However, believe it or not, the REST API URLs can actually be used to create brand new posts or update existing posts. For example, if you wanted to change the title of an existing post, or we can even use these URLs to delete an existing post. Now again, in the case of a search, which is what we are currently building, we only need the R in CRUD, right? We only need to read or load in content. But don't worry, a bit later on in the course, we will indeed learn how to create new posts and update or delete existing posts through the REST API. Okay, by the end of this course, we will cover all 4 bases of the CRUD acronym. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. So right now, let's stay focused on building our live search results feature. Now, before we get started and jump into the action for this lesson, I just have one final note for you. So yes, we are going to learn a lot about the REST API throughout this course, but I do want you to be aware of the official WordPress documentation on the REST API. Now, of course, the luxury of the video course that you're watching right now is that you don't need to come to this documentation and study everything, right? My job is to make this easy to understand, but I do want this to be on your radar because this is from the official source, right? This is wordpress.org. This resource contains everything you could ever want to know about the REST API. Okay, now having said all of this, let's jump right back into the action and let's learn how to generate HTML based on the incoming JSON data for our search results. So right now, let's jump into our text editor. And in our theme folder, let's go into the JavaScript modules folder and open up search.js. And let's scroll down to our method that is named getResults. Remember, this is the method we created in the previous lesson that sends out a request to this URL that is powered by the WordPress REST API. And then once this URL or the WordPress server has a chance to respond, then this line of code will run. And remember, just as a test, we were creating an annoying alert pop-up message that looked inside the array of the incoming JSON data and then output the title property. So as of right now, if I open up the overlay and search for biology, we see a pop-up with the title of a post from the search results. But that's not what we actually want. We don't want to create a pop-up. We want to display the results as HTML, right? We want to replace the div with this spinner loader icon to contain the results. So back in our code, let's delete this alert line that creates that pop-up message, and instead let's try to edit the HTML of this results div. You might remember that we have a property that belongs to our object named results div. So we can say this dot results div, and then we can use the jQuery method named HTML to adjust its markup. So just as a test, we could say imagine results here. But before I go ahead and save this, I need to take care of an issue that has to do with the this keyword. Because within the body of this anonymous function, remember if I scroll over to the right, this is the callback function that will run once the URL and server has had a chance to respond. Anyways, within that function, that anonymous function, the this keyword is going to point towards the getJSON method, because that's what executed the function. So the question becomes, what can we do so that on this line of code, the this keyword still points towards our main search object? Well, there are two main ways of achieving that. The first is to just use bind like we've been doing all along, right? So if I scroll to the right, this anonymous inline function definition begins right here, and it ends down here with this curly bracket. So just like we've done before, right after the mention of a function, we can just say dot bind this. So that's our first option, but let me actually delete this bind this. So I'm just deleting from the period that we just added to the end of the bind this parentheses. So let me put that back in place. And I want to show you a second way of handling this. So if I scroll over to the right, whenever you create an anonymous inline function like this, right, a function that doesn't have a name, we can use an alternative JavaScript syntax, which is commonly called an ES6 arrow function. So let me show you what we can do. Instead of saying function and then parentheses with our parameter, we can delete that and instead just type out the name of a parameter that you want. And then instead of spelling out the word function, we can just say greater than, smooshed together to create this symbol. And this is what we call an arrow function. And the nice thing about this is that it does not change the value of the this keyword. So when this code runs, this will still be pointing towards our main object, so we are in business. So if I go ahead and save that, give it a test, if I search for award, perfect. We see imagine results here. So now instead of this placeholder text, let's output the real deal. So when we are modifying the HTML of that div, let's delete this placeholder text. And instead, let's imagine we want to output a heading level 2 that reads general information. And then right after the heading level 2, maybe we would want a bulleted list of the different results. So an unordered list, opening and closing. And then within there, we would have a list item for each post in the results. But right away, you'll notice that writing HTML on one line like this is miserable. When HTML is smooshed together on a single line, it's really hard to look at and work with. Now, in the past, we were forced to do this with JavaScript because there was no easy way of breaking down to a new line. For example, in traditional JavaScript, when you open up a string of text, if I wanted to drop down to a new line maybe after the H2, notice my text editor immediately throws the color red to show me that something's wrong. So in traditional JavaScript, to get around this, at the end of a line, you could add a backslash, and that's okay, right? So then you could just break down a new line whenever you want to. So this is starting to look like normal HTML on different lines, but who wants to go through the trouble of adding a backslash at the end of every line? That's not very convenient. So let me Control Z to undo. Now, luckily, in modern JavaScript, there's something named a template literal that will solve a lot of our problems. So check this out. Let's completely empty out the parentheses for the HTML method. So let's go back to just this, right? We want to modify the HTML of this div. And now, instead of creating a traditional string of text using single quotes or double quotes, instead of that, let's use a backtick. So this is the key on your keyboard that's directly to the left of the 1 key. And I'm not referring to the 1 key on your number pad. I'm referring towards the left side of your keyboard. So just get a backtick, 2 of them actually, and in between them, we can now do basically whatever we want. So let me show you what I like to do. In between our 2 backticks, I actually like to drop down to a new line, and let me get the indentation to line up. And now that we've created a template literal with the backticks, we can just write good old-fashioned HTML and drop down to new lines without any problems. So let's create a heading level 2 and have it say general information. And then below that, let's create an unordered list. And within that, let's create a list item. And within the list item, let's create a link, right? So you can click on the result. For now, let's just set the href to be a hashtag as a placeholder. And let's close out the link. Okay, and then within the A tag, this is what the user will actually click on. So we can say click me just as a test. And before we save this, why don't we add a few classes to our elements just so CSS styling is in place and things will look nice. So on the heading level 2, I'm going to give it a class of search-overlay __ section title. That will control the color and the font size. And then on the unordered list, let's give that a class of link list and min list. Okay, let's go ahead and save this and test it out. Open up the search and look for biology. Cool, looks good. So now let's just actually use our real JSON data for this result item. So back in the code, instead of this placeholder title of click me, let's use the actual title of the results post. So remember that this anonymous function of ours has a parameter named posts, and this is where we can access all of the incoming JSON data. So back in our click me area, since we are in the middle of a template literal, which was created by our backticks, by default, any text that we type is not going to be evaluated as JavaScript code. It's just going to be output onto the page as plain text. However, if we do want to run a JavaScript expression, right, or access a piece of dynamic data that lives within our posts parameter, all we need to do is this. So if we delete this hard-coded click me, and in its place, let's type out $ and then curly brackets. Now in this context, the $ has nothing to do with jQuery. Within a template literal, the $ in combination with curly brackets is a native part of JavaScript. This combination of characters tells JavaScript that what we are about to include within the curly brackets should be evaluated as real JavaScript code, instead of just plain text or string text like the rest of this. So within this expression, within the curly brackets, we can just say posts to start working with that incoming JSON data. And remember, it's an array, so let's look within the first item in the array. And then we are interested in the title of the post, so .title. And then let me open Postman just to refresh our memory. So for example, if someone searches for biology, this JSON data will be the result. And notice that the title property is an object itself that contains an inner property named rendered. And that's where the title lives. So back in our code, let's look inside the title property for rendered. Okay, let's go ahead and save this and test it out. So if I search for biology, perfect. There we see the title of the resulting post. But if I click on this link, nothing happens. And that's because we did not fill in the href value. So let's do that now. Let's just delete that placeholder hashtag. And then instead of just plain text, we want to evaluate a little bit of JavaScript. So $, curly brackets. Okay, and then let's just look inside our JSON data for the first item in the array. And then in Postman, you'll notice that there's a property named link, and that contains the permalink. So within our code, once we are looking at that first item in the array, let's just say dot link, and that will grab the URL property. So let's save that. And now if I search for biology again, there's the link, and if I click on it, it actually takes me to that post. And that's great, but what about search terms that we know will return multiple results? So for example, if I search for lorem, as in lorem ipsum, I have at least 4 or 5 blog posts that contain this word. However, we only see one result item here because our code is hard-coded to only work with the first item in the resulting array. So for example, in Postman, if I perform a search for lorem, in the results, you can see that there are 4 objects, right? 4 blog posts. So let's learn how to write code in the JavaScript of our template literal to loop through an array, right? We want to do something once for each item in the array. Now, before we worry about working with the actual post objects, why don't we do this? So follow along and type this out with me. Right above this line where we are editing the HTML for the div, right above that, let's create a test array. So var for variable, and we could name it whatever, but let's name it test array. And let's set it to an array that just contains red, orange, yellow. Okay, and let's imagine that within our bulleted list, we want to create a list item for each one of these items. So down here, let's actually delete this list item. So now we've just got an empty, unordered list. And let me show you a neat way that we can loop through an array within a template literal. So to begin an expression, we use $ curly brackets. And then let's just type out the name of the array. So the name of the variable is test array. And in JavaScript, every array has access to a method named map. And map can be used to create a new version of the array. Now within the parentheses for map, it wants us to give it a function that it will run once for each item in the array. Now instead of referencing another function, why don't we just create an anonymous inline function right here? And let's actually use the shorthand arrow function syntax. So let's give ourselves a parameter named item. You could choose any parameter name you want. And then the arrow symbol. And then normally you would create curly brackets to create a body of the function, but if you write it all on one line, you don't even need the curly brackets. So for each item in this array, let's just do this. Let's create a template literal within the context of our map method. And we just want to create a list item for each one. And inside the list item, let's use this expression combo, say item. So this would be a list item, and then this would get substituted with the value of red, and then the value of orange and yellow. So with the map method here, we are creating a new version of the array that uses list items. But when the template literal tries to output the array, it's still going to include commas in between each item. So what we can do is right after the map method, so right after this closing parenthesis here, we can say dot join. And in JavaScript, join is how you can convert an array to a simple string. Now within the parentheses, if we said dash or X, that will be placed in between each item. But if we just include a blank quotation, there won't be anything placed in between each item when they get converted to a string. So if we go ahead and save this, perfect. We see a list item for each one of the values in the array. So now all we need to do is forget about this test array of red, orange, and yellow. Let's delete that line. And down here, instead of working with test array, let's delete that, and let's work with our posts parameter that contains the JSON search results, right? So each item in this array is a blog post. So let's do this. Let's output a list item, and within it, let's create a link. Okay, now the text that someone should click on is the title. So let's use an expression, and we can just say item dot title dot rendered. And then for the href value, we can just create an expression and say item dot link. Okay, and if I go ahead and save that and perform a search for lorem, beautiful. We see all of the search results. That's going to bring this lesson to a close. Let's keep it rolling, and I'll see you in the next one.